So it's the time for the last talk of this session, and it's Matt Blenkinsop's a new developer's guide to Koha and Perl. Yeah. Welcome.
Thanks very much. So I'm Matt. I'm here with PTFS Europe. I'm just going to give you a quick run through of sort of my experiences in both the Koha and Perl communities since I've joined. So just going to start with a little bit about me and my background and what I mean by a new developer into those communities. Then a little bit about the company and the rest of the team, because it's not just my experiences that are part of this presentation. There's a couple of other new developers in our team as well, so it's sort of a combined set of experiences. How I got started with Koha, we'll look at as well, what steps I had to go through and what obviously any other new developer will need to go through to get into the community and start developing. The challenges that we faced as part of that, and obviously what could potentially be done to try and improve in that scenario. The first steps that I took in terms of learning Perl, because Perl was a brand new language to me, starting in Koha and with PTFS. And then a bit about the community involvement I've had as well, and that's a bit more Koha specific, because really this conference is my first involvement in the Perl community. So excited to see what that community's got this week. Then just to finish, a little bit about what we could maybe do to try and bring some new devs into both communities. So what could potentially be done on that front. And then obviously if we've got time at the end, any questions that anyone's got. But I know we've got a break after this, so people might want coffee. So just a bit about me and my background and what I mean by a new developer. So those of you scanning the slides will see that 6 years working in the rail industry is not a normal developer's career path. So that's where I started straight out of university. I went on to a 2-year graduate scheme and then did some roles working as a commodity buyer and a global buyer. But eventually deciding that that wasn't the career path for me. That's not where I saw myself going forwards. I've been doing a little bit of coding in the background, sort of hobby projects, that sort of thing. I had a couple of friends, and also my brother is a developer. So they were sort of pointing me at a few things and realized that I enjoyed it far more than what I was doing. So I took the decision to quit. So after 6 years working there, and if there's one thing I learned in those 6 years is that the UK rail network was built about 200 years ago and nothing has changed since. So it was time to get out. So I took about 4 or 5 months off and I taught myself to code, focusing on JavaScript for a couple of reasons. One is that the developers that I knew were JavaScript developers, so they were pointing me in that direction as a good language to start with, which is very sort of popular. There's a lot of jobs, etc. If you're going to try and change career, that was the direction they pointed me in. But I also did my own research as well. I wasn't just going to believe them. And that obviously was a lot of that stuff on the internet was sort of pointing in that direction as well. So obviously Perl the Koha project has got some JavaScript, so those skills have been able to transfer over, but Perl was brand new to me after that training once I started with PTFS. I sort of built a bit of a portfolio, a mixture of small projects. So for example, I cloned the game Wordle for those of you that played that, which is quite a good project to do because you can play Wordle every day and pretend that you're working. So that was sort of what I was doing, and then some sort of larger applications as well, building those into the portfolio, just to try and evidence that I could actually do what my CV was pretending I could do. So I started applying for jobs back in sort of September, October last year. And for those of you that know anything about UK politics, that's just when Liz Truss decided to crash the UK economy. So the job market really closed up, but thankfully people were still hiring. One of those was PTFS. And if I've got one tip from applying to those jobs, it's that if you apply to a company and they send you a list of questions to answer and the job description asks for a candidate with attention to detail, make sure you spell the company's name right when you're answering those questions. I spent a lot of time on the answers. I typed them all out and I hit send, and as soon as it refreshed on the page, I immediately spotted in the last paragraph PFTS instead of PTFS. And I thought, I hope that's just a one-off, but it was all the way through. So I couldn't believe I hadn't noticed, but thankfully no one at PTFS did either. So they hired me, and I've been putting typos into Koha ever since. But yeah, so I started back in mid-November 2022. And just a quick bit about PTFS Europe. It is PTFS. That just for those of you that might not have heard of us, we're an open source library solution support company based in the UK. So obviously we're very involved with Koha. We also support Aspen alongside of that for a lot of our customers, as well as Folio and Metabase, two of the other products that we support. And we're 24 people now, which has grown quite a lot even since I've joined. And we've got 5 devs, 2 or 3 working on Koha at a time. So we try and rotate around to cover all the products that we're supporting. Just some Twitter and YouTube links there. I think the YouTube was mentioned earlier. Thanks to Kelly and Jesse for mentioning that. That's got some sort of helpful videos and content on there for anyone that wants to sort of go and check that out and see if any of that's going to be any use to you. I mentioned the 5-man strong dev team there, and that's obviously, I said at the start that we've got quite a few new devs in the team. So it's a collective set of experiences. Some of you will know Martin's name. He's been in the community for what feels like forever. He's been with PTFS, I think, pretty much since it started. So he's got a huge amount of knowledge. But then you look at the dates further down and you can see that Jacob and I only joined, well, I think it's about 9 months ago now, which is already flying past. Pedro very quickly after in January, and then only 6 or 7 weeks ago we took on Alexander as well. And you can see Jacob, myself and Alexander, we're all in as junior software engineers because all 3 of us were completely different career paths before joining. I think Jacob was a chef, which is a pretty normal leap, chef to developer, and Alexander was a teacher. So all 3 of us have come from completely different fields, and so we've had to really try and, I guess, adjust, not just to working with Koha and with Perl, but working in a sort of a tech environment as well. So there's been some challenges there, obviously, which is what we're going to try and cover today. The one thing I'll say now is that obviously we've gone through this experience of starting, but we have had access to Martin, who's probably one of the best resources around because of how much he knows. But obviously the IRC community chat's been mentioned a few times today. So if there's anyone thinking of getting involved, you have got access to similar resources. You just need to try and pop into the IRC, and there's generally going to be someone in there that can help you. I guess the advantage we have is that when you pop into IRC, you're hoping someone helps you out of the kindness of their heart, whereas Martin is contractually obliged to help us. So it doesn't matter how much we annoy him. So when we first started, obviously one of the first things that we did was try to set up Koha testing Docker, KTD. And this was back in November. So this was before, at the time, there were 2 separate repositories. There was one for the ARM architecture, which was obviously what I needed to run on MacBook. And then there was a normal repository, which the rest of my team were all running because they all run Linux environments. At the time, we didn't know that repository existed. So I spent probably best part of a week staring at error logs, wanting to throw my laptop out the window, wondering why the KTD wouldn't boot up for me, whereas for Jacob, it was up within an hour. And at the time I was feeling a bit stupid, but luckily Martin didn't know either, so that made me feel a bit better. But as you'll see there, that says pre-integration, so that is now combined and both are all into one repository, so it's now covered by that one KTD repository, and that's supporting all of the different system architectures, which is obviously a massive improvement. So once I'd finally got up and running, I could actually start to look towards submitting my first batch. This quite luckily was just after the 22.11 release and the new CSS changes. And one of the sort of frequent issues with the white background sections were missing in various parts of Koha. So those just needed a quick 1-line fix. So that was a very easy way of just getting through the process of using the Bugzilla tools and going through the first sort of sign-off and QA procedure. And I have to say that was a very smooth process. I think Bugzilla, it's not a perfect tool, but I don't think there is one. And I think it works very well for what we use. I think there's been some discussion about using in discussion or not. And that's obviously something that the community maybe there's some differences on, but I think generally the process works pretty smoothly, and also being able to just integrate straight from your dev environment into that makes sort of the code process flow very smooth. So I was quite pleased with how simple that was for a first time starter. That was something that potentially I was a bit worried about, but it was a very smooth process to go through. And then shortly after joining, we signed up as PTFS as a whole, the whole dev team, to do the release maintenance for the 2211 branch. So for those of you not familiar with the term release maintenance, that's effectively making sure that the latest release, as it was at the time, 2211, all of the bug fixes that are still coming through community are being pushed back into that stable branch, and then obviously flowing down through the other releases that we're still supporting. So we did that for 6 months up until May, when we released 2305. And now Pedro and myself are still the maintainers for the old stable branch for 2211. So I'll take this opportunity now with a live audience to say if there's anything wrong with 2211, it's Pedro's fault. Hi, Pedro, if you're watching. So that was the first steps that I took in Koha, and obviously over the last sort of 6 months or so. So I've already mentioned, in terms of challenges faced, the integration of the two repositories that existed. That I think is a massive step forward, and we've sort of proven that now at PTFS by not just having the dev team installed with KTD. We've now got a number of instances running across the company in different teams, and we're finding that, to be honest, there's a lot of use for KTD beyond just the developers. So for example, those of you that saw the usage statistics demo this morning that Jonathan did, that was run through KTD, also installed on a MacBook, which was very smooth and easy to do. I think Ord is running a lot of the documentation stuff through there and using it for screenshots, which he's finding very handy. And we've also got our data migration specialist running it on a Windows environment, and he's using that for some plugin development to help them with the data migrations. So he's finding a lot of use out of having a sort of environment he can mess around with and not worry about breaking a test server or something that he's been using in the past. And similarly for customer support, we're finding that that can be a good way of just testing something and making sure you're not going to cause a problem with sort of a solution that you're putting onto a support ticket. One of the big challenges I faced in the early days was going from my own personal projects, where I've written all of it and they're quite small really, to going to something as big as Koha. It's hundreds of files, there's so much code in there. I think when you first start, it's quite daunting and intimidating just working out where something is. You might have a one-line fix that you need to do, and it takes you half an hour to work out where that goes. So I think we had a very quick run through with Martin around sort of the model view controller concept that of how to use that to find files. And I think just maybe a very quick guide, which I might look to put together just for new developers, just to try and take away some of that potential intimidation. And just little things for people who maybe aren't used to Perl systems, like the fact that the script name appears in the URL, and you can very quickly use that to try and find out where you need to be looking in the code. So that's something I'm going to look to try and put in place, just maybe to help anyone who's looking in and thinking it's a bit too much for that first attempt at a bug fix. Further documentation improvements I think that could definitely be done are things, for example, we've got the KTD plugin tools, which are brilliant for developing plugins. And obviously we've been using that, like I mentioned, with one of the members of our team. But at the moment, the docs for how those work are sort of in a small footnote at the bottom of the KTD repository. They're not in the main KTD wiki, the Koha wiki. I think the plugin tools that are in that wiki are still quite sort of out of date. So I think that's something, because it's a really, really useful set of tools that we can use to develop with those. I think that would be something definitely worth documenting properly, or at least transferring the documentation we've got into sort of the location where the rest is kept. Cypress testing is relatively new really with ERM. That's not something that we've, I guess, had in Koha for very long, but I think I've seen on a few ERM bugs people asking how to run the Cypress tests when they're required. I think that again is something that maybe could be documented a bit better, because there's various ways of running the Cypress tests. You can run them in the CLI, or you can have a window that pops up and runs the test through in front of you. So there's lots of different ways of doing that, and I think that could be definitely documented. The Git Bugzilla integration setup and the tools for that, I think I mentioned earlier, it was very smooth, but obviously at the time we had Martin helping us run through and set that up. I did go back and have a look in preparation for this presentation at those tools, and I think the explanations are there and they're good. But I think for someone who's maybe less technically minded, there might be a few steps where they might not be 100% confident on what they're trying to do. So one of the things that I want to try and do going forward, because it's easy for me to stand here now and say we need to fix the documentation, but I'm going to try and put an hour or 2 hours a week going forward, if I can, towards trying to help with the documentation. And I guess general plea to anyone in the room who's maybe thinking about giving some of this a try and maybe getting set up. If you're using any of the documentation at any point, and there's something that you're not clear on or isn't quite, very easy to follow, then please jump into the IRC or get in touch with someone in the community and just point that out to us, because a lot of the time we don't know the documentation needs fixing, especially if you're the one that wrote it. It makes sense to you because you know what you're doing, but to someone else it might not. So if anyone sees anything that they're not sure on, then please let us know, and that's the easiest way that we'll be able to improve the documentation. There was a lot of work that we did at Hackfest back in March, identifying areas in documentation, and I think, like with a lot of things, there was a bit of progress shortly afterwards, but then I think, like everything else, life catches up and other work, and I think slowly things have maybe tailed off. So I want to try and revive that list and see where we got to with things and what I can maybe look at sort of a couple of hours a week to try and help improve. So moving on to Perl, and obviously slightly different observations. These are more my observations compared to what I've previously learned in terms of JavaScript, because whilst my obviously role is working on Koha, and Perl is the main tool that I'm using for a lot of that, but I am still using a lot of JavaScript within that Perl work, such as the view elements that we're using now. So pretty early on, I realized that it was really, really good for text and date processing. I don't know how many people in the room have worked with dates in JavaScript and wanted to throw your laptop out the window. It's really in a different world when it comes to that. For me, referencing and dereferencing was a completely new concept. I think quite a lot of the bugs that I put into Koha that fail QA come back for referencing. So that's something that was very new to me, as well as having to end every line with a colon. Every time I write code, I go and test it and I get a compilation error because I've forgotten countless semicolons. So I think that button's already quite worn, or I've mashed it angrily on a number of occasions. And then the final point, this one's almost a plea for help, to be honest. When you're running a query for the database, and in JavaScript you run the query, and if you want to just check that the data that you've got back is what you're expecting, it's very easy to just log that to the console. You get a nice JSON object and you can quickly see what that data is and whether that's what you're expecting. For example, you run a query to fetch 2 patrons, and you know that it's going to fetch 2 patrons because that's what you're aiming to do. And you can very easily see those 2 patron objects and check that's what you've got. Whereas what I still haven't worked out in Perl is I write that query and I put a dumper in to dump that out to the logs, and I get what seems to be the whole database schema. Can't work out what that data actually is. I have to start doing unblessed, as list, and all these things, destructuring it. A lot of the time I write the query and the query might work first time, but it takes me half an hour to work out what. So it might be that there's someone in this room that knows an answer to that and can tell me within 30 seconds. And if you can, if there's one thing I want to take away from this conference, it's an answer to that. Actually, no, it's stickers. I want stickers, but also an answer to that. So if you've got an answer, please come and find me, or stickers. But if that is something that actually maybe isn't quite so easily done in Perl, then I don't know, maybe there's something that could be done in terms of an expansion on the dumper library or something similar. But as I say, there probably is an answer. I just haven't found it yet, and it's something that's really been quite different for me versus working with JavaScript. Obviously, when I first started, I had to go away and learn Perl. And obviously one source that I had was the Koha code itself and trying to look. But before that, I need to learn sort of the basics and how to actually start working with Perl. And there is a lot of stuff out there online. There's a lot of documentation. There are sort of courses on how to learn the basics. Some of them quite interactive, where you do a little exercise and then you read about something and you do an exercise to move on. But I think there's 2 stages really to learning how to actually, there's learning the basics of the language, and then there's learning how to actually go away and use that. And I think it's similar when you learn a spoken language. It's one thing learning the words, but another thing entirely to actually learn how to put it together, and also what is the best way to put it together, what is actually used. And I think there's definitely not as much with Perl of, for example, how to build a shopping app or a small social media app, that sort of thing. If you go on YouTube for JavaScript and say how to build a shopping app with React or with Vue, there will be hundreds of results, loads of series. And I think they're a very interactive way to learn because you can follow on yourself, or you can take what you've got in that video and start to adapt it to your own projects. And also you pick up a lot of best practices from people who really know what they're doing, because Perl is one of those languages where there's so many ways of doing things. And if you're just taking the documentation and then trying to apply something, you might end up doing something that you could do so much easier, which someone who's got more experience might be able to show. So I think that's possibly an area where the sort of the Perl resources are lacking, is that next step of how to go about building something. So just a bit on the community involvement that I've had within Koha. First thing, it's a very welcoming and friendly community. It's been very sort of nice to get involved, and everyone's been so welcoming here and at Hackfest as well. IRC is active pretty much every day, so anyone who's got questions is welcome to drop in, and generally there'll be someone in there who knows the answer. So I'd highly recommend that as a starting point for trying to get involved. I know it's had a few mentions today. Hackfest, I was lucky enough to go in March this year, and that was a really brilliant event. I would highly recommend that to anyone who wants to try and get involved. It's not necessarily just for developers. We had a lot of library staff there this year, and that was really useful because I think it's been mentioned in a talk earlier today that we are developers, we're not librarians. So what we might think is the right way to do something isn't necessarily the right way to do something, and it's useful to have all those different inputs and experiences there. So I would highly recommend that. Release maintenance as well. I think that's one of the really good things that I've done since starting, and I think for any other support companies that bring new developers in, that's something I'd really recommend getting a new dev into, especially if there's someone with my level of experience, because I think Koha is so large, as I've said, that sometimes you can work on it for weeks, months, maybe even years, and you'll never touch certain areas of it. You'll have no idea what's happening in that particular part of Koha. Whereas with release maintenance, you're watching all of the bugs and the changes come through, and you're sort of just keeping a general awareness of what's changing. And quite often, if we have support tickets and stuff come through from customers, we recognize something from release maintenance that we think might have had an impact because we've seen that come through our queue. And it's brilliant as well for improving Git skills, because teaching myself and my own projects, all I needed was git add, commit, and push, and that's all I really had to use. So I think having to deal with conflicts and then also doing some debugging on tests that fail occasionally if you've not quite rebased something, and I think there's a lot of value to be had from doing that, especially as a new developer into the community, because it just gives you a much more in-depth introduction. So just finishing off with what could potentially be done to try and bring some new developers in. Just some small points and observations. Obviously, some of these I've covered. So Perl, as I've mentioned, just more, I guess, next step online resources, I'll call them. So that sort of how to do things. I think that's, if people want to learn how to do something before they've even chosen a language, they might just go and Google, how do I do this? And they'll start to pick the languages probably that give them the most results and look the most active and popular. And I think that's possibly somewhere where Perl is not quite as, the resources aren't as rich as in other languages. They are probably out there, but they're probably harder to find, and there's maybe not as many, or they're maybe a bit more out to date. So that's something that I really noticed when I first started. Once I'd done the basics of Perl courses, there wasn't much beyond sort of just going into Koha and using that as my reference point. But as I say, that's so big, it's very hard to get a grasp of Koha as a whole. So smaller style applications would have been very useful. For Koha, every little helps. So we've got a lot of people already involved with doing sign-off. Some of our customers, for example, do that using the sandboxes. So if there's any library stuff in the room today, probably all in the Finnish library user group presentation. If there is anyone in here, then we always welcome sign-offs. That's really useful to have librarian input on those. And that can be done either with the sandboxes, or if people want, they're more technically minded, they want to set up the KTD. As I've said, it's got a lot of uses beyond just development, and one of those is that you can sign off patches. And then obviously the next step from that is to maybe look at some of the academy bugs and then from there progress, make some more contributions and start to become active as Koha developers. So I think there's definitely a way to try and encourage people who are involved in Koha maybe in a small way, and then start to try and upstream them maybe into contributing a bit more. I think there could be a lot of value to have from that, especially if we have more librarians who are actually able to contribute a bit of development rather than just developers guessing what librarians want. Then in terms of sort of cooperation, I think it's been mentioned obviously in the fact that we're having this joint conference, I think is a really good event. And I think the two communities can do a lot to promote each other. So I know on the Koha wiki, we've got some Perl resources, and I think that could be expanded just to promote what's out there for people to go and have a look at. And I think from a Perl perspective, there's a lot of developers out there that might be looking for Perl projects to be involved in. And maybe I would assume that Koha is probably one of, if not the biggest, open source Perl project out there. And so I would say that probably promoting that as a starting point for people to go and have a look at would be a very good way of sort of sharing the resource between, or the promotion between the two communities. That's my experience as a developer. So thank you very much. And any questions?
For your issue with trying to get some of the data, you wrote DBIX. Are you these are Koha wrappers around DBIX class? Okay, yeah, you asked about getting that information easier. It's too much right now, but if you want to talk to me afterwards, I can show you a couple of things.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, no problem.
Yeah, I will document those.
Not really a question, but bravo for your quick integration into the community and
thank you
for your involvement.
Thank you very much. No one else?
Any more?
I'm actually curious to ask, when you say IRC, do you mean Internet Relay Chat or something else?
Yes.
Because you didn't have a channel name there, so you're just supposed to go to the IRC and hopefully find...
The links are all on the Koha website, so
cool.
yeah, hit the Koha website and all the links are available there.
Congrats, nice talk, and you went very fast within the community. That's remarkable. I wanted to ask about new developers' involvement. When we started the API, one of the key ideas was we could revamp our interface, the user interface, using new tools. Do you think we are in a good position regarding our Vue integration? Do we have good documentation on the libraries we've developed or the framework we developed?
So just said on the Vue integration, did you say?
Yeah.
Yeah. As in Vue.js, not Vue as in the page.
Sorry for that. Vue.js.
Vue.js. Yeah, I think the ERM module was the starting point, and I think that's obviously that's growing. I think there's usage statistics coming, and I think a preservation module as well using Vue. So I think there's a lot of, I guess, example and existing code there, which could start to be used. I think there was potentially some work to move cities to Vue as well, as an example. So I think with the example code that we have, I think we're definitely in a position to start doing it because I guess the integration from that first ERM setup has been done. We've got integrations to the API that exists in Koha, the Swagger API, but also that is pretty easily accessible now through the Vue application. So I think there's definitely a very strong position to start moving forwards with that.
As a new Koha developer, can you provide some feedback to the QA team about the best ways to give feedback to new developers? Like how can we help tell you when things need to be done differently? Like what kind of feedback do you prefer?
Well, I think for me personally, the feedback I've had has always been sort of very constructive. I've never felt like I'm being, sort of told my code is rubbish or anything like that. And I'm aware that probably for a lot of cases it is. So I think I've always found it very constructive. I think generally, obviously I've had different sizes of bugs. So for example, when it's quite a large, let's say lots of changes going through at once, I think the point you made in your talk earlier about breaking it up is definitely something that I'll consider moving forwards. But I think generally Katrine, for example, is very good at breaking it out point by point, and then you've got sort of a numbered list that you can go through and address. So I think generally it's been pretty constructive, and I guess it's probably personal to each developer, but I don't think your feedback is ever sort of the thing that anyone would ever take as an insult. So.
Any more questions? No more.
Oh,